The sun was just beginning to rise over the quiet streets of Marion, Ohio, when the unmarked vehicles pulled up to the small ranch house on the corner of West Street. It was early March 2024, and the neighborhood was still mostly asleep, curtains drawn against the cold morning air. Neighbors who happened to be awake, pouring their first cups of coffee or letting dogs out into frost-covered backyards, watched with growing confusion as detectives emerged from their cars, their breath visible in the chill. They walked with purpose toward a house that had stood on that corner for decades, a house where someone familiar lived, someone who had been part of this community's fabric for as long as anyone could remember. And when the door opened, when the handcuffs clicked shut around wrists that had shaken hands at church picnics and town festivals, the confusion turned to something darker. Disbelief, horror. Because after 21 years of questions that hung over this town like a shadow, after 2 decades of wondering who could have done something so unspeakable, the answer had finally arrived. And it was someone they knew. Before we continue this story, take a second to hit subscribe and like this video. Your support helps bring these forgotten stories to light. The arrest that morning wasn't just the resolution of a criminal investigation. It was the answer to a question that had haunted Marion, Ohio since the spring of 2003, a question whispered at grocery stores and school parking lots, a question that changed how parents watched their children and how neighbors looked at each other. Who killed Anna Williams? The 8-year-old girl with the gap-toothed smile and the purple backpack had vanished from her own neighborhood on an April evening, and for 21 years her name had been synonymous with heartbreak in this small industrial town. Her face had aged artificially on missing persons posters, showing what she might have looked like at 15, at 21, at 29, though everyone knew she would never grow older than 8. The case had gone cold so many times that some people had stopped believing it would ever be solved. But forensic genealogy, a technology that didn't exist when Anna died, had finally done what decades of traditional detective work could not. It had pointed investigators to a name, and that name had shocked everyone. But to understand the weight of that arrest, to understand why grown men and women wept in the streets when the news broke, you have to go back to 2003. You have to meet Anna Williams when she was still alive, still vibrant, still just a little girl living an ordinary life in an ordinary town. Anna Marie Williams was born on a snowy January morning in 1995, the youngest of 3 children in a family that ran on laughter and routine. Her father, Tom Williams, worked at the Whirlpool manufacturing plant on the edge of town, the kind of steady job that had sustained Marion families for generations. Her mother, Beth, worked part-time at the public library, shelving books and helping elderly patrons navigate the new computer system. They lived in a modest 2-story house with yellow siding and a chain-link fence around the backyard, the kind of house where kids' bikes lay on the lawn and basketball hoops hung above garage doors. Anna shared a room with her oldest sister, Melissa, who was 12 and already rolling her eyes at everything her little sister did. Their brother, Jake, was 15 and mostly interested in his garage band and a girl named Crystal, who worked at the Dairy Queen. Anna was the kind of kid who made friends easily. She had light brown hair that her mother usually pulled into 2 ponytails, and she'd lost her 2 front teeth that winter, giving her a lispy quality when she talked that made adults smile. She loved art class more than anything, and her drawings covered the refrigerator, the walls of her room, and most of her schoolwork margins. Horses, mostly. She drew horses constantly, filled entire notebooks with them, and had informed her parents repeatedly that when she grew up she was going to have a horse farm and live somewhere with mountains. Her 3rd-grade teacher, Mrs. Ismind Patterson, had just nominated one of Anna's drawings for a student art show at the county library. Beth had already bought a new dress for Anna to wear to the opening reception. That dress would later hang in Anna's closet for years, tags still attached, a ghost of a future that never came. Marion, Ohio in 2003 was the kind of place where people still left their doors unlocked. It was a town of about 35,000 people, small enough that you recognized faces at the grocery store, but big enough to have a Walmart and a movie theater. The downtown had seen better days with several empty storefronts on Main Street, but there were still Friday night football games that everyone attended and a 4th of July parade that shut down traffic for hours. It was the kind of town where people moved away for college and either never came back or returned within 5 years to raise their own families. Safe, predictable. The kind of place where parents let their kids ride bikes around the neighborhood until the streetlights came on. That's exactly what Anna was doing on April 23, 2003. It was a Wednesday evening, unusually warm for April in Ohio, one of those first real spring days when winter finally loosens its grip and the air smells like thawing earth and new grass. Kids had been outside all afternoon, riding bikes, playing basketball in driveways, drawing hopscotch grids on sidewalks with stolen chalk. Anna had eaten dinner quickly, spaghetti and garlic bread, barely touching her food because she was eager to get back outside. Her best friend, Emma Chen, lived 4 houses down, and they had a plan to practice riding their bikes with no hands, something Emma's older brother had taught them the weekend before. Beth had stood at the kitchen window washing dishes and watching through the glass as Anna pedaled down the sidewalk, her purple backpack bouncing on her shoulders. She'd made Anna take the backpack because it had reflective strips on it, and even though it was still light out, Beth was always thinking about when it got dark. Anna had rolled her eyes, the way kids do when their parents are being overprotective, but she'd worn it. That image, Anna on her too small bike with the purple backpack catching the early evening light, would be the last time Beth Williams saw her daughter alive. According to Emma Chen, who was 9 years old at the time and would have to repeat her story to police officers, detectives, grief counselors, and eventually her own therapist for years afterward, everything had been normal. They rode their bikes up and down the street. They practiced riding with no hands. Emma fell once and scraped her knee, and Anna had helped her up and told her she was brave. They saw other kids they knew. Tyler Morrison was shooting hoops in his driveway. The Kowalski twins were walking their dog, Mrs. Damble. Henderson was watering her flower beds and had waved to them. Just a normal Wednesday evening in a normal neighborhood where normal things happened. Around 7:15, Emma's mother called her inside for a bath before bed. Emma asked if Anna could come over to play the next day after school. Anna said yes. They did their secret handshake, something they'd invented that involved 3 hand slaps and a pinky promise. Then Emma went home, and Anna got back on her bike. Multiple neighbors reported seeing her after that. Mrs. Henderson saw her riding past around 7:20. Garcia, who lived at the end of the block, saw her circling the cul-de-sac around 7:30. She was alone. She appeared fine. She was just a kid on a bike on a spring evening, doing what kids did in neighborhoods like this. At 8 o'clock, when the streetlights came on, Beth Williams opened the front door and called for Anna to come home. This was the rule, the non-negotiable boundary. Streetlights meant inside, no exceptions. But Anna didn't come riding up the driveway. Beth called again, louder this time. She walked out onto the porch, looked up and down the street. A few other kids were heading inside, called by their own parents. But no Anna. Beth walked down to the Chin house. Had Anna come back to play with Emma? No, Emma was already in her pajamas, wet hair combed back from her bath. Beth felt the first flutter of worry then, but she pushed it down. Anna had probably lost track of time. She walked the block, checking the usual spots. The Morrisons' driveway. The little playground at the end of the street. The Kowalski's yard where kids sometimes gathered to pet their golden retriever. No Anna. By 8:30, Beth was back home, and the worry had become fear. Tom called Anna's name from the car as he drove slowly around the surrounding blocks. Melissa and Jake were sent on their bikes to check the school playground 3 blocks away, Anna's second favorite place after Emma's house. Neighbors emerged from houses asking what was wrong, then joining the search. By 9 o'clock, someone had called the police. The Marion Police Department dispatched 2 officers, and when they arrived and heard the details, they immediately called for backup. An 8-year-old girl, missing for over an hour, last seen on her bike in the neighborhood. This wasn't a runaway situation. Anna was 8. She didn't run away. The officers began organizing a systematic search while Tom and Beth stood on their front lawn, holding each other, watching flashlights bob through yards and between houses as darkness settled completely over their street. By midnight, there were over 100 people searching. Volunteers had shown up from all over town, off-duty police officers, teachers from Anna's school, members of their church, people organized into grids, walking shoulder to shoulder through vacant lots and wooded areas that bordered the neighborhood. Dogs were brought in. Anna's pillowcase was sealed in evidence bags so the K-9 units could have her scent. Someone found Anna's bike around 1 in the morning, lying on its side in the grass near the entrance to Glenwood Park, a small wooded area with trails that the neighborhood kids sometimes explored during the day. The bike was fine, undamaged, just lying there as if Anna had set it down and walked away. But Anna's purple backpack was gone. The discovery of the bike changed everything. It gave the search a focal point. If Anna had left her bike at the park entrance, maybe she'd gone into the woods. Maybe she'd gotten lost or hurt. The search intensified, focusing on the wooded trails and the areas beyond. Hope and dread battled in equal measure. They wanted to find her. They were terrified of what they would find. Beth Williams stood at the edge of the park as dawn broke on Thursday morning, surrounded by strangers and friends who had been searching all night. The spring warmth of the previous evening had given way to a cold morning, and someone had draped a blanket over Beth's shoulders. She hadn't slept, hadn't eaten. She just stood there watching the tree line, waiting for her daughter to emerge from the woods, dirty and scared but alive. That's what she told herself. Anna had gotten lost. She'd spent the night in the woods, frightened but okay, and any minute now someone would call out that they'd found her. That call came at 9:47 on Thursday morning, but it wasn't the call anyone wanted to hear. A volunteer searcher, a local contractor named Mark Stevens, found Anna's body in a shallow ravine about half a mile into Glenwood Park, partially concealed by fallen branches and underbrush. She was still wearing her favorite shirt, the pink one with the sparkly heart. Her purple backpack was found 20 feet away, its contents scattered. The medical examiner would later determine that Anna had been dead since sometime Wednesday evening. She had been strangled. There was evidence of sexual assault. The person who did this had left her there, covered her partially with branches, and walked back out of those woods into the same neighborhood where people were beginning their frantic search. The sound Beth Williams made when the police officers came to tell her is something that people who were there say they will never forget. It wasn't a scream. It was something deeper, something animal, the sound of a soul breaking. Tom Williams collapsed to his knees in the front yard. Melissa, who was standing on the porch, started hyperventilating so badly that paramedics had to give her oxygen. Jake punched a hole in the living room wall and then sat on the floor crying, cradling his broken hand. And Marion, Ohio, a town where people left their doors unlocked and kids rode bikes until the street lights came on, learned that nowhere is truly safe, that evil doesn't always come from strangers passing through, but sometimes it lives right next door, hiding behind a familiar face, waiting for a moment when an 8-year-old girl is alone. The investigation into who killed Anna Williams was about to consume this town for the next 21 years. And the answer, when it finally came, would prove that the most terrifying monsters are often the ones we think we know. The investigation began within hours of finding Anna's body, and it began with the kind of intensity that only a child's murder can generate. The Ohio Bureau of Criminal Investigation sent a team to Marion by Thursday afternoon, joining local detectives who had already cordoned off Glenwood Park and begun processing what was now a crime scene. Yellow tape stretched between trees, and investigators in white protective suits moved carefully through the ravine where Anna had been found, documenting everything, photographing every leaf and branch, collecting evidence with meticulous care. They found fibers on Anna's clothing. They found DNA evidence, though in 2003, the technology to fully utilize such evidence was still evolving. They found footprints in the soft earth near where her body had been concealed, size 10 men's boots with a distinctive tread pattern. They bagged everything, labeled everything, sent everything to the state crime lab. This case would be solved, they assured the grieving family. Someone had done this terrible thing, and they would find them. The first suspect emerged within 48 hours. His name was Curtis Hayden, and he was a drifter who had been seen in Marion that week, sleeping behind the old textile mill and panhandling near the Walmart. He had a criminal record in 3 different states, including a conviction for attempted abduction in Kentucky 7 years earlier. When police tracked him down in a homeless encampment near the railroad tracks, he ran. That was enough. They brought him in, questioned him for 16 hours, searched his belongings, took his DNA. Curtis Hayden maintained he had nothing to do with Anna's death, said he'd never even been near that neighborhood, didn't know anything about any missing girl. But he couldn't account for his whereabouts on Wednesday evening. He had no alibi, no one who could vouch for where he'd been when Anna disappeared. For 2 weeks, the town was convinced Curtis Hayden was the killer. The newspaper ran his mugshot on the front page. People drove past the police station and shouted obscenities. Someone spray-painted child killer on the wall of the abandoned building where he'd been sleeping. But then the DNA results came back. Curtis Hayden's DNA didn't match the evidence collected from Anna's body. The boot prints didn't match his shoes. He wore a size 8. The prints in the woods were from a size 10, and a store security camera had captured footage of him at a gas station 15 miles outside Marion at 7:45 on Wednesday evening, right around the time Anna was last seen. He couldn't have been in two places at once. Curtis Hayden was released, and the investigation had to start over. The second suspect was worse because he was one of their own. Robert Vickers was a registered sex offender who lived on Maple Street, exactly 2 streets over from the Williams family. He was 43 years old, had been convicted of unlawful sexual contact with a minor in 1997, and was required to register his address with local law enforcement. Parents in the neighborhood knew about him. They'd received the notifications when he moved in. They'd warned their children to stay away from his house, the one with the overgrown yard and the broken porch railing. Now, with Anna dead, every eye turned toward Robert Vickers. Detectives obtained a warrant and searched his house on a rainy morning in May, while neighbors gathered on the street to watch. They spent 7 hours inside, emerging with boxes of evidence. They took his computer. They took his clothing. They took samples from his carpets and his car. They questioned him extensively, going over his movements on April 23rd in minute detail. Robert Vickers said he'd been home alone that evening watching television. He had no alibi. He couldn't prove where he'd been, but he insisted repeatedly that he had nothing to do with Anna Williams. He hadn't even known who she was until he saw the news. The town didn't believe him. How could they? He was exactly what everyone imagined when they thought about who could do something like this. Protesters gathered outside his house. Someone threw a brick through his window. The prosecutor's office leaked to the press that Vickers was a person of interest, and that was enough to convict him in the court of public opinion. Beth Williams told reporters she hoped he would rot in hell. Tom Williams had to be physically restrained from confronting Vickers outside the courthouse during a hearing. But then, once again, the evidence told a different story. Robert Vickers' DNA didn't match. The fibers on Anna's clothing didn't come from his house or his car. His boots were size 9, not size 10. And when investigators pulled his phone records, they found that he'd made a call to his parole officer at 7:58 on Wednesday evening from his home landline. The call had lasted 12 minutes. The timeline didn't work. By the time that call ended, Anna would have already been dead or dying in those woods. Robert Vickers, as horrifying as his past crimes were, hadn't killed Anna Williams. The investigation sprawled outward, touching dozens of lives, turning over rocks that revealed all kinds of secrets, but never the right one. They looked at Anna's teachers, her coaches, the parents of her friends. They investigated a janitor at her school who had a sealed juvenile record. They questioned a man who'd been fired from the library where Beth worked and had allegedly made threatening comments. Every lead was pursued with desperate thoroughness, and every lead eventually dissolved into nothing. The DNA evidence remained unmatched. The boot prints led nowhere. Whoever had killed Anna Williams had simply vanished, leaving behind only questions and grief. Where are you watching from today? Have you been following a case in your own community that's gone cold? Let us know. And the lead detective assigned to Anna's case was a man named James Keller, and this investigation would come to define the final decade of his career and haunt the years after it. Detective Keller was 52 years old in 2003, a 26-year veteran of the Marion Police Department with a reputation for being thorough and patient. He had solved murders before, robberies, assaults, the usual crimes that occurred in a town like Marion. But Anna Williams was different. Maybe it was because she was so young. Maybe it was because his own daughter was only 2 years older than Anna. Maybe it was because he'd stood in the Williams living room and watched a family disintegrate from the inside out, and he'd promised them he would find answers. Whatever the reason, James Keller couldn't let this case go. Even as the years passed, even as other cases demanded his attention, Keller kept returning to Anna's file. He kept boxes of evidence reports and witness statements in his office, boxes that eventually moved with him when he retired in 2015. His wife, Margaret, would find him at the kitchen table at 2 a.m, crime scene photos spread out before him, reading the same reports he'd read 100 times before, hoping to see something he'd missed. He attended every vigil the Williams family held. Every year on April 23rd, he drove to Glenwood Park and walked the trails where Anna had died, retracing the path the killer must have taken, trying to understand. The Williams family's grief became a permanent fixture in Marion. Beth stopped working at the library. She couldn't bear to be in public spaces where people would look at her with pity or, worse, avoid her eyes entirely. She spent most of her time in Anna's room, which she refused to let anyone touch. Anna's drawings still covered the walls, her stuffed animals still arranged on the bed. The dress bought for the art show still hung in the closet, tags attached. Tom went back to work at the plant because they needed the money and because sitting at home was unbearable. But coworkers said he'd aged a decade in a matter of months. His hair went gray. He stopped smiling. Melissa, Anna's older sister, developed severe anxiety and depression. She blamed herself, though she'd been at a friend's house when Anna disappeared and had nothing to do with what happened. But she was the older sister. She should have been watching out for Anna. She should have been there. The guilt manifested in self-harm, in eating disorders, in a suicide attempt when she was 16 that landed her in psychiatric care for 3 months. She eventually moved away from Marion as soon as she turned 18, fleeing the town and the memories, though the trauma followed her. Jake, the oldest, channeled his grief into anger. He got into fights at school, was arrested twice for assault before he was 18, and developed a drinking problem that would plague him for years. He stayed in Marion, unable to leave but unable to heal, working construction jobs and spending his evenings at the same bar where his father had started drinking heavily after Anna's death. The Williams family didn't just lose Anna that April evening. They lost themselves. The town held vigils on every anniversary of Anna's death. In the beginning, hundreds of people attended, filling the church and spilling out onto the lawn, holding candles and singing hymns and crying together. But as the years passed, as the case remained unsolved, the crowds grew smaller. 5 years after Anna's murder, maybe 75 people showed up. 10 years after, it was down to 30. 15 years after, it was mostly just the Williams family, a few loyal friends, and Detective Keller, who came every single year without fail. Marion hadn't forgotten Anna exactly, but the town had moved on in the way towns do. New families moved into the neighborhood. Kids who'd been born after 2003 rode their bikes on the same streets where Anna had ridden hers. Life continued because it had to, but Beth Williams never moved on. She became obsessed with the case in a way that worried her family and her doctor. She created a website dedicated to Anna's memory and the unsolved investigation. She posted on true crime forums hoping someone out there might have information. She called Detective Keller so often that he had to gently ask her to limit the calls to once a week, unless she had new information. She printed flyers with Anna's picture and the tip line number and posted them around town, even though after a few years, people started taking them down, uncomfortable with the constant reminder of tragedy. On Anna's 18th birthday, a day when she should have been graduating high school, Beth organized a small memorial at Glenwood Park. The county had cleaned up the ravine where Anna had been found, had built a small garden there with a bench and a plaque with Anna's name. Beth sat on that bench for hours, surrounded by wilted flowers and rain-soaked teddy bears that people had left over the years, and wondered what Anna would have looked like at 18. Would she have had a boyfriend? Would she have kept drawing? Would she have finally gotten her horse farm? These were the questions that tormented Beth in the quiet moments, the what-ifs and the never-to-bes. Detective Keller retired in 2015, but retirement didn't mean forgetting. If anything, it gave him more time to focus on the case that had eluded him for 12 years. He set up a workspace in his garage, pinned maps and timelines to corkboards, and began going through everything again from the beginning. His wife worried about him. Their daughter, now married with children of her own, begged him to let it go, to enjoy retirement, to stop carrying the weight of an unsolved case that might never be solved. But Keller couldn't. He'd made a promise to Beth Williams, to Tom, to Melissa and Jake. He'd stood in their living room and looked them in the eyes and said he would find who did this. 13 years later, he still hadn't. That failure sat in his chest like a stone. The breakthrough, when it finally came, emerged from technology that hadn't existed when Anna died. Forensic genealogy, the process of using DNA evidence to build family trees and identify suspects through genetic databases, had made headlines in 2018 with the arrest of the Golden State Killer. Law enforcement agencies across the country suddenly realized they could revisit cold cases with preserved DNA evidence and potentially identify perpetrators who had evaded capture for decades. In 2019, the Marion Police Department, working with the Ohio Bureau of Criminal Investigation, decided to submit Anna's case DNA to a forensic genealogy lab. The process was painstaking and slow. Genealogists built family trees based on the DNA profile, searching through public genetic databases where people had voluntarily uploaded their information, hoping to find long-lost relatives. They identified distant cousins, then worked backward through generations, following branches of family trees, eliminating possibilities, narrowing the field. It took months of work, then it took years. The genealogists would hit dead ends and have to backtrack. They'd find promising leads that ultimately went nowhere. But they kept working, kept building the tree, kept following the genetic breadcrumbs that the killer had unknowingly left behind. In December 2023, they identified a cluster of DNA matches that pointed to a specific family line in central Ohio. From there, they narrowed it down to 3 possible male relatives of the right age who had been living in or near Marion in 2003. One had died in 2007, one had moved to Arizona in 2001. The third still lived in Marion, had lived there for his entire life, had been there on April 23, 2003, and had never left. When Detective Sarah Chen, who had inherited Anna's case after Keller's retirement, saw the name that forensic genealogy had delivered, she had to sit down. She read it 3 times, certain there had been a mistake. She called the lab. She double-checked the family tree. She cross-referenced everything. But there was no mistake. The DNA evidence, after 20 years of being unmatched in databases, after sitting in storage waiting for technology to catch up, had finally pointed investigators to a name. And that name was going to shatter what remained of Marion's innocence. Because it wasn't a stranger. It wasn't a drifter or a registered offender or someone the town could easily cast as a monster. It was someone who had lived among them for decades, someone who had attended the vigils, someone who had helped search for Anna that terrible night, someone who had hidden in plain sight for 21 years, protected by the simple fact that he seemed like a normal person, a good neighbor, someone you'd never suspect. Detective Chen spent 3 months building the case, obtaining warrants, conducting surveillance, gathering additional evidence. They collected DNA surreptitiously from a discarded coffee cup to confirm the match. It confirmed. They subpoenaed old phone records and credit card statements. They re-interviewed witnesses with this new suspect in mind, and suddenly details that hadn't made sense before clicked into place. By March 2024, they had enough. An arrest warrant was issued. And on that cold morning when the unmarked cars pulled up to the house on West Street, when the detectives walked with purpose toward a door they'd walked toward before during the initial investigation 21 years earlier, when the handcuffs clicked shut around familiar wrists, Marion, Ohio, Leah, Arned that the person who had killed Anna Williams had been their neighbor all along. The arrest would make national news. The trial would grip the nation. But for the people of Marion, for the Williams family who had waited 21 years for this moment, the arrest was both a relief and a horror. Justice was finally within reach. But the truth, as it so often is, was far worse than anyone had imagined. The name released to the public on March 14, 2024 sent shockwaves through Marion that felt almost physical. David Coleman, 57 years old, a married father of 2, a high school guidance counselor who had worked at Marion Harding High School for nearly 30 years, a volunteer Little League coach, a member of First Presbyterian Church, a man who had lived 3 blocks from the Williams family in 2003, who had joined the search for Anna that terrible night, who had attended her funeral and stood in the back of the church with tears running down his face. The forensic genealogy had built a family tree that pointed directly to him, and when detectives secretly obtained his DNA from a discarded coffee cup outside the school where he worked, the match was absolute and undeniable. David Coleman's DNA was found on Anna Williams' body. The boot prints in the woods matched a pair of hiking boots seized from his garage, boots he'd apparently kept for 21 years. And when investigators dug deeper into his background, they found a pattern of behavior that had been hiding in plain sight, red flags that no one had thought to connect to an unsolved murder. The arrest happened quietly, deliberately, on a Tuesday morning before school started. Detectives didn't want to create a scene in front of students, so they waited until Coleman arrived at his office. That small room plastered with college pennants and motivational posters where hundreds of teenagers had come over the years seeking advice about their futures. They knocked on his door at 7:45. He opened it with a coffee mug in his hand, smiled at them the way he smiled at everyone, friendly and open, the kind of smile that had made him popular with students and parents alike. Then Detective Sarah Chen identified herself and asked him to come with them. They said they had questions about an old case. Coleman's smile faltered for just a moment, a flicker of something passing across his face too quickly to read. Then he nodded, set down his coffee, and asked if he could get his coat. He was calm, eerily calm. He walked out of the school between two detectives like he was going to a meeting, not toward the end of his carefully constructed life. The interrogation lasted 9 hours, and portions of it would later be played at trial, would be analyzed by legal experts and true crime enthusiasts, would be broken down second by second for signs of deception or remorse. Coleman sat across from Detective Chen and her partner with his hands folded on the table, his lawyer beside him, and for the first 7 hours he denied everything. He said he didn't know why his DNA would be on Anna Williams. He suggested contamination, said he'd been part of the search party, maybe there had been transfer evidence. He said the boots weren't his, or if they were, he didn't remember. He'd owned lots of boots over the years. He was calm, reasonable, the same way he'd been calm and reasonable with grieving students, with struggling teenagers, with parents worried about their children's futures. He'd spent 3 decades learning how to say the right thing, how to project trustworthiness, how to make people believe him. But then Detective Chen laid out the genealogy evidence. She showed him the family tree that connected him to the DNA found on Anna's body. She showed him the photographs of the boot prints and the boots from his garage, explained how the wear patterns matched perfectly, how the distinctive damage to the left heel was identical in both. She showed him his own phone records from April 2003, calls he'd made that evening, including one to the Williams house at 8:45, after Anna was already dead, asking if there was anything he could do to help with the search. And she showed him something else, something that made Coleman's carefully maintained composure finally crack. She showed him records from his computer, forensic evidence recovered from hard drives he thought were long gone, images that revealed the truth about who David Coleman really was beneath the surface of the helpful guidance counselor and devoted family man. After his lawyer called for a break, after whispered conversations in the corner of the interrogation room, Coleman came back to the table and his entire demeanor had changed. The mask had slipped. He looked older suddenly, tired, defeated, and he started talking. Not a full confession, not exactly. His lawyer wouldn't allow that. But he admitted he'd been in Glenwood Park that evening. He admitted he'd seen Anna. He claimed it was an accident, that things had gotten out of hand, that he never meant to hurt her. The detectives listened, documenting every word, watching this man who had fooled an entire community for 21 years finally reveal himself. He spoke in a flat, emotionless tone, describing the murder of an 8-year-old girl as if he were discussing a regrettable mistake, an error in judgment, something that had simply happened rather than something he had chosen to do. The news of Coleman's arrest and partial confession exploded across Merriam like a bomb. Parents who had trusted him with their children's futures were physically sick. Students he had counseled, some now adults with children of their own, struggled to reconcile their memories of kind Mr. Style. Coleman with the monster he actually was. His wife, Karen Coleman, released a brief statement through her attorney saying she was shocked and devastated and had no knowledge of her husband's crimes. Their 2 daughters, both grown women in their 30s who had been in middle school when Anna died, refused to comment publicly. But neighbors reported seeing moving trucks at the Coleman house within a week, the family fleeing the only home they'd known to escape the association with what David D. done. The trial began in September 2024, and the Merriam County Courthouse had never seen anything like it. Security was tripled. A lottery system was established for the limited public gallery seats. News vans from Columbus, Cleveland, even national networks lined the streets outside. The prosecution's case was methodical and devastating. They presented the DNA evidence, the boot prints, the forensic genealogy that had finally identified Coleman after 2 decades. They presented evidence from Coleman's computers showing a long history of viewing child sexual abuse material, a digital trail that revealed his predatory nature. They presented testimony from a forensic psychologist who explained how Coleman had likely been grooming and offending for years, how Anna Williams was almost certainly not his only victim, though she was the only one they could prove. The defense tried to poke holes in the forensic genealogy, suggesting it was an unreliable new science, but the DNA match was too strong. They tried to argue that Coleman's partial confession had been coerced, but the video of the interrogation showed otherwise. They tried to humanize him, calling character witnesses who spoke about his work with students, his volunteer coaching, his involvement in the community. But those testimonies backfired spectacularly. The jury wasn't moved by stories of Coleman helping teenagers with college applications when the evidence showed he'd strangled an 8-year-old girl and left her body in the woods. The defense had no real strategy because there was no defense. The evidence was overwhelming. Beth Williams attended every day of the trial. She sat in the front row of the public gallery with Tom beside her, the two of them holding hands so tightly their knuckles turned white. Melissa flew in from Seattle, where she'd been living since leaving Marion, and Jake took time off from his construction job. They sat together, the fractured remnants of what had once been a happy family, and listened to the details of how Anna had died. They looked at David Coleman's back, at this man they'd known, this man who had hugged Beth at Anna's funeral and told her he was so sorry for their loss. Beth told reporters during a break that the hardest part wasn't the anger, though there was plenty of that. The hardest part was remembering how she'd thanked Coleman for helping search for Anna that night, how she'd stood in her front yard and shaken his hand and told him she appreciated his kindness. She'd thanked the man who had murdered her daughter for pretending to help find her. Detective James Keller attended the trial too, sitting in the back row, watching the case he'd worked for 12 years and carried for 9 more, finally reach its conclusion. He was 73 years old now, his hair completely white, his hands shaking slightly from the Parkinson's disease he'd been diagnosed with 2 years earlier. When he testified about the initial investigation, about the evidence collected and the years of dead ends, his voice was steady, but his eyes were wet. After his testimony, Beth Williams found him in the hallway outside the courtroom and hugged him for a long time, both of them crying, both of them thinking about all the years between that terrible night in 2003 and this moment of approaching justice. The prosecution called dozens of witnesses, but perhaps the most powerful testimony came from Emma Chen, Anna's best friend, now 30 years old and living in Columbus, where she worked as a pediatric nurse. Emma took the stand wearing professional attire, her hair pulled back, looking nothing like the 9-year-old girl who had been the last person besides David Coleman to see Anna alive. She described that evening in April 2003, the bike riding, the practicing with no hands, the secret handshake before she went inside for her bath. She described hearing the next morning that Anna was missing, not understanding what that meant, thinking maybe Anna had just gotten lost. She described learning that Anna was dead and understanding for the first time that children could die, that someone could hurt you, that the world wasn't safe. Her voice broke when she said that she still thought about Anna almost every day, still wondered what kind of person Anna would have become, what they would have talked about if Anna had lived to be 30, like Emma was now. She looked directly at David Coleman when she said that he hadn't just killed Anna. He'd killed the future, killed all the years Anna should have had, killed the person she was supposed to become. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours. They found David Coleman guilty on all counts: aggravated murder, kidnapping, rape of a child. The conviction carried a mandatory sentence of life without the possibility of parole. When the verdict was read, Coleman showed no emotion. He sat perfectly still, staring straight ahead while his lawyer patted his shoulder. But Beth Williams sobbed, a sound of relief and grief mixed together. 21 years of waiting crystallized into this single moment. Tom buried his face in his hands. Melissa and Jake held each other and cried. The sentencing hearing took place 3 weeks later, and this was when the Williams family finally got to speak directly to the man who had destroyed their lives. The judge allowed victim impact statements, and one by one, they approached the microphone. Melissa went first, her prepared statement shaking in her hands. She talked about the sister she'd lost, about the guilt she'd carried, about the years of therapy and self-harm and the suicide attempt that almost succeeded. She talked about how David Coleman hadn't just killed Anna, he'd nearly killed her too, and he'd definitely killed the happy childhood she should have had. She looked at him and said she hoped every single day of his life in prison was torment. Jake spoke next, his large frame hunched over the microphone, his voice rough. He talked about Anna teaching him how to do her secret handshake with Emma, about how she used to draw pictures of horses for him and tape them to his bedroom door, about how he'd failed to protect her and how that failure had poisoned everything good in his life. He talked about the drinking, the fights, the rage that had consumed him for years. He said he lost 21 years to grief and anger, and Coleman would lose the rest of his life to a prison cell, and that still didn't feel like enough. Tom Williams spoke briefly, his statement just a few sentences. He said he'd worked at the same plant for 37 years, had been a good father and husband, had believed in God and community and the basic goodness of people. David Coleman had taken all of that from him. He no longer believed the world was fundamentally good. He no longer believed his children were safe. He no longer believed that justice existed, not really, because even life in prison couldn't bring Anna back. He sat down without looking at Coleman, his shoulders shaking. Beth Williams was last. She stood at the microphone for a long moment without speaking, just looking at David Coleman, this man who had taken everything from her. When she finally spoke, her voice was quiet but clear. She said she used to imagine what she would say to Anna's killer if they ever found him. She'd imagined screaming, cursing, expressing all the rage and hatred that had built up over 2 decades. But now that the moment was here, she realized that David Coleman wasn't worth her rage. He was nothing. A coward who had murdered a child and then pretended to grieve with her family. A predator who had hidden behind a respectable job and a friendly smile. She said she didn't forgive him, would never forgive him, but she also wouldn't let him take anything more from her. He'd taken 21 years. He wouldn't get another day. She was going to honor Anna's memory by living, by finally allowing herself to heal, by making sure that Anna was remembered for who she was, not just for how she died. She pulled something from her pocket, a small photograph, worn and faded from being carried for 21 years. It showed Anna at age 7, grinning with her 2 front teeth still intact, holding up a drawing she'd made of a horse. Beth held the photograph toward Coleman, made sure he could see it. She wanted him to see Anna's face, to remember that she had been a real person with dreams and a future, not just a victim. Then she put the photograph back in her pocket and returned to her seat. David Coleman was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole plus 65 years on the additional counts. He was immediately remanded to custody and transferred to a maximum security facility in southern Ohio. He will die in prison. He will never again walk freely down a street in Marion or anywhere else. He will never again pretend to be a helpful neighbor or a caring counselor. The mask he wore for 57 years has been permanently stripped away, and everyone can see the monster underneath. After the sentencing, the Williams family held a private memorial at Glenwood Park, at the small garden the county had built where Anna was found. They planted a cherry tree, Anna's favorite, near the bench with her plaque. They stood together, this broken family that had somehow survived, and they talked about Anna, sharing memories, crying, and occasionally laughing at stories about her stubbornness or her obsession with horses or the way she used to narrate everything she was drawing out loud. Detective Keller was there, standing slightly apart, watching this family he carried in his heart for 21 years finally begin the process of healing. Detective Chen was there too, the investigator who had finally closed the case that had haunted Marion for 2 decades. The sun was setting as they stood in that small garden, golden light filtering through the trees that had witnessed such horror and now stood as silent guardians of memory. Beth placed fresh flowers at the base of Anna's plaque, purple ones, Anna's favorite color. Tom put his arm around her, and they stood there together, looking at their daughter's name etched in bronze, Anna Marie Williams, January 15, 1995 to April 23, 2003, forever 8, forever loved. The case of Anna Williams is closed now. David Coleman will spend the rest of his life in prison, and Marion, Ohio has finally received the answers it waited 21 years to hear. But the story doesn't really end with an arrest or a conviction or even a sentencing. It ends with the quiet, ongoing work of healing, with a family learning how to live with a loss that can never be filled, with a community grappling with the knowledge that monsters can hide behind the most ordinary faces. It ends with technology finally catching up to justice, with forensic genealogy giving voice to victims who had been silent for decades. It ends with Beth Williams visiting her daughter's memorial and talking to Anna the way she used to, telling her about her day, about Melissa's new job, about Jake finally getting sober, about how much she misses her, how much she'll always miss her. 21 years is a long time to wait for justice. Long enough for children to grow into adults, for parents to age into grandparents, for entire lives to be lived in the shadow of one terrible night. But justice, however delayed, still matters. The truth, however painful, still has value. And memory, even memory of the worst moments, keeps the people we've lost alive in the only way we have left. Anna Williams will never grow up. will never fulfill her dream of having a horse farm in the mountains, will never become the person she was meant to be. But she will be remembered. Her story will be told, and the man who took her life will spend every remaining day of his own life paying for what he did in those woods in April 2003, while Anna's family finally, tentatively, begins to find peace.